Born in Pittsburgh, moved on to very big things, served our nation in the Air Force, has brought children into the world as an obstetrician, taught them economics lessons as an author and activist, and carried the torch for libertarianism into the U.S. Congress from the 14th Congressional District, Lake Jackson, Texas. He's now the host of the Liberty Report and a former presidential candidate. I hope you enjoy this edition of Kevin Battle Goes One-on-One with Dr. Ron Paul. Dr. Paul, welcome home to KDKA Radio.
Great, and it refreshed my memory that KDKA is a historic station. Is KDKA the station that was the one, like the first one in the country?
Yep.
That's a well-known station.
Absolutely.
So it has to be a good station if it's lasted that long.
It's still a great station. Yes, the first commercial radio station, November 1920. It was the Harding Cox election results that we broadcast live for the first time.
Oh, that's pretty neat. That was before I was born.
Absolutely. And in full disclosure, you are one of two candidates that I have ever donated a dime to. I gave money to a friend of mine who was running for mayor in Virginia, and at one point in 2007, I had $65 cash left. I sent you $35.
Oh, well, that's wonderful.
So I know you're in a good mood because D.C. has just increased the debt ceiling by $2.5 trillion. That's a good thing, right?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, but the people who are on the receiving end, the people who have to pay it, they're going to suffer the consequences. No, philosophically, morally, constitutionally, it's all terrible. If you care about inflation, it's all a negative. And it's a symbol of being anti-liberty. So I was complaining about the budgets when they were much, much smaller. I think when Reagan went in, it was less than $1 trillion, the whole budget. Now what it was in the past year has been $7 trillion. Now the debt and the spending level is very, very important because for one reason, in many ways, the country's gotten away with it because it's been bad. We have embarked on this. This was unleashed in 1971 when we got off the gold standard, and yet we survived it all. But the people keep suffering because even if you go from 1971 to now, the average person, the middle class person has been suffering. Their standard of living is going down, even with two people in the family working. Back when I lived in Pittsburgh, my mother and dad went through the Depression and all, but my mother didn't have to leave household. So no, the country is poor. And the thing that you mentioned, that's where it all starts, the appetite for that spending. And it's not just social democrats, and it's a whole culture. Republicans and Democrats. If Republicans help that thing get passed, so it's endorsed by the people. So it's the people who have to stop, and they say enough is enough. But they're not going to do that until they have runaway inflation.
Absolutely, and I believe that debt is slavery on any level. You have to work to pay your debts, and each citizen, regardless of age, right now owes $87,000 towards that $29 trillion national debt.
Right.
Is debt the biggest threat to our sovereignty, or is China, or is COVID-19?
Well, I put it all together. It's the attack on liberty is it. And so the debt is symbolic of it. The spending is a big deal. The universities are a big part of it. I worry less about Russia invading the United States or even dropping bombs on us. Same way with China. So yes, we should have concern, but we ought to analyze it differently, especially with China. I mean, they're the ones that are number one on our list by the people. If you say anything sympathetic for China, then you're unpatriotic. But, we've lived beyond our means. We've had the reserve currency of the world. We counterfeit the money. The world has trusted us. We still remain very wealthy. And our greatest export is money, dollars, Federal Reserve notes. And the Chinese, they liked it, and they had hardworking people. While we were less productive, it was much better for us just to print the money and go and buy up all our stuff from China. China now, their balance sheet's much better than ours. And it is something that we created. We got the stuff and they got our paper, and they're spending our paper money, and they're buying stuff up around the world, like in Africa and all. And we spend a lot more money on militarism than they do. And the people have to realize they should reassess themselves if they think China is a major problem. I don't think they should be ignored, but I say the problem is as much with us as with them. We know what communism is all about, but we also know that if we're living beyond our means and they're loaning us some money, it's a coalition that has led to many of these problems.
Is that what spurred you into politics? I'm guessing it had something to do with the fiat currency, the paper money, and not the gold standard.
Yes, and it was in 1971, August 15th, 1971. I moved from Pittsburgh in 68. I finished my residency at McGee. I came down here to open up my practice in 68. But in 1971, during that time, even when I was doing my residency in Pittsburgh, I got fascinated in monetary policy in the Austrian School of Economics as I was continuing to study medicine. So there were a lot of predictions in the 60s that this monetary system, the dollar standard, and how powerful the dollar was, especially after World War II. We had all the gold and we had the least amount of damage to our country, and it allowed us license to steal, that is, print money, to be the counterfeiters of the world. But in 1971, people around the world, especially the French, realized that we were passing out Federal Reserve notes and they were losing value. And they said, well, you guys promised that we would be careful and protect the value of the dollar and we wouldn't print more dollars than we have gold. Everybody knew we were doing exactly that. So under Nixon, there was a run on the bank, a run on the gold. So in a way, it was a form of bankruptcy. We had to do something, and we had to decide that the world will just loan us money as we counterfeit the money, and they've gotten away with it for a long time. But I think what we're witnessing now today on our economy is this coming to an end. But it was in 1971 with the close down of the gold window and getting rid of the gold standard, putting on wage and price controls and all these things that were just terrible in the 1970s. Because I had been fascinated with this and it was predicted, then I thought, I want to speak out on this. But I started just going to different meetings that I could get to, and they were easier to get in a political sense. I'd get out there, and my wife's first reaction was, what are you doing this crazy thing for? She says, that's a dangerous thing to do. You could get elected and mess up our whole lives. We won't be able to practice medicine. And I said, don't worry, Carol. I said, it's not going to happen. They're not going to elect me. I'm promising them nothing about their freedom. And they want stuff from the government. So, but it turned out that she was right and I was wrong, because it was politically more successful. And it gave me a little bit of encouragement that there were people that were willing to listen to a different option, and they still thought something about sound money.
Independence seems like such a logical choice, yet so many people cede that option in favor of security. And you said that you didn't think you'd get elected the first time. Why is freedom and liberty not an obvious choice for millions of voters?
Because the free lunch is more enticing. You don't have to work for it.
That federal Ponzi scheme is it, huh?
Yeah, responsibility. People don't automatically assume the responsibility, although there are a lot of people who are born with understanding the delight in having self-reliance and having this satisfaction. I certainly had that taught to me, and I was, being raised in Greentree, and my dad was in the dairy business. Work and hard work and savings was a big deal. I mean, I was able to mow lawns and deliver newspapers, the Pittsburgh Press, and deliver that and save enough money. By the time I went to college, I was able to pay my first year of college, just with the money I saved there. But somebody said, yeah, but college wasn't very expensive back then. That's right. And the dollar was worth more. So after 8 years, I decided I want to go back to medicine. I didn't want to give up medicine. So I went back to medicine for 12 years. And then I don't know exactly what motivated me. The same thing. It was still the effort to defend liberty. I think I had a better understanding that liberty is more than the gold standard, and that's just one part of it. The drug war, the wars that are going on around the world, all these things that bear down to understanding the principles of individual liberty and self-reliance, and making government very, very small, rather than depending on the government. And so it led to more things. And I understand you actually remember when in 07 that I was running for something.
Yes.
And I was just as shocked then. I used to walk into these college events. I had a nice couple events I know in the Pittsburgh area. And that to me just astounded me, because I really indeed thought that it's a modest approach to trying to deliver something I strongly believed in, and that I don't know anything about politics, and that people didn't care. Well, I came away and that what I discovered, especially when I went to the college campuses, that a lot of young people get a bad rap, get blamed for a lot of nonsense. But it was the college campuses that really came out. And I'd look at the crowds and go, what are they doing here? And but they were always welcomed the message. And one kick I got out of it, I'd talk for usually an hour or so. And those first 45 minutes be a lot of what we've already mentioned. The country's bankrupt, and there's too much inflation, too many wars are violating our civil liberty. And I say, you're hearing this and you have to do something about it. But after about 45 or 50 minutes, I'd shift gears. And I said, but it's not complicated. You can solve the problem. And so it would be all giving the answers in a more upbeat message. And I was always surprised when afterwards people would come up to me and they say, I really like to hear your speeches. Here, I thought I was giving them all this dire stuff. You better be worried. And they said, well, I like to listen to you because you're so optimistic. So that helped me be optimistic, because people were responding in a positive fashion.
Absolutely. You have a very friendly tone. And speaking of college campuses, there's a move now to abolish college debt, abandon debt altogether. I guess they just want other people to pay for the loan. That's just going to taxpayers are going to pay for that.
Yes, one way or the other, and it's going to be hard to identify the people who are going to pay for it, because nobody's going to pay for it. When we're totally bankrupt, more so than we are now, people say, like a couple of weeks ago, they said, if we don't raise the national debt, you're not going to get Social Security and all this stuff. That isn't true. But the debt gets eliminated. It gets liquidated. So whether some of these people who owe their money default and the government picks up the debt and a few people lose some money, but most people are going to lose because everybody's going to get bailed out. The Social Security beneficiaries are going to get their checks. And just what happens when you have COVID or some other emergency or another war, they're going to get their money, but they're not going to get their value. And therefore, the debt gets liquidated. But once again, the very people who are pushing for this, some of these students, get rid of my debt, they're going to suffer a lot too, because they're going to pay for it with higher prices. They can't say, okay, send me a check. And just think of how many people receive checks from COVID, from the Republicans and the Democrats. But now that has added to the fuel of inflation. And now they're talking about inflation is like a roaring fire, and it's just lit. And people are losing their purchasing power. Their standard of living is going down. And that's how the debt will be paid. Debt will be liquidated. The market will liquidate debt. The government will never quit printing. They will always print the money and try to bail out. But it's an impossible task. It's trying to deal with something that's absolutely impossible. It's sort of like picking a few people, sending them to the Federal Reserve and ask them, what we want you to do is decide what the interest rate should be today, tomorrow, and the next day, and how much money supply you need. They can't do it. It's impossible, and just makes a mess of things. So the debt will be liquidated, and I think that it will not be distributed equally. Some people will be smart enough to avoid it and protect against it once they know what's coming. Others who push the spending and maybe the bailouts will suffer the consequences, because everybody's going to pay more money for their bread and their butter and their beef.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And you mentioned COVID-19. How would a President Ron Paul or a Governor Paul of Pennsylvania have handled the COVID situation?
Well, I wouldn't. I would just avoid handling it. That's like managing it. I would have doctor's credentials that would help me giving advice. But the last thing I'd want to do is turn it over to Dr. Fauci. He never has seen a patient. So all he is a bureaucrat, and they're going to spend more money, and they're lockstep with the pharmaceutical companies. So they're just going to advocate one thing. Don't take vitamin D, don't take zinc, and don't take hydroxychloroquine. That's banned in this country. I would avoid all that. it should be done by the states. It should be done with the doctor-patient relationship. They should be making all the decisions. And if you had to have some decisions made, DeSantis have set some standards that would have guided us toward the states and away from the federal government. But it would be best to have recognized that there was a lot of hoax associated with that, and it continues today. A lot of misinformation, and that, of course, is what we spend a lot of time on in Ron Paul Liberty Report, trying to pick and choose what is true and not true.
You mentioned voting. I mean, you've been through a few elections in your time. Voters' rights is a big issue right now. Georgia changed some laws. Pennsylvania has changed laws. Texas. There's all kinds of states that are doing things. What is the best route for trying to figure out election laws and helping people run an election responsibly? Do you think that it'll come to a point where they should show an ID to vote or a vaccine card to vote? What's the deal?
If you don't require a voter ID and enforce it rather strictly, you shouldn't vote. And there's nothing to it. Now they're legalizing voting of illegal aliens. They come in and they automatically, you reward people with an automatic citizenship and the right to vote and the right for the handouts, and they come by the millions. That's a big contribution because we will not stop. As a matter of fact, the priorities are all screwed up. They're in front of the line. They get in front of the line of the American citizen who innocently went along with this nonsense and paid into the system, but the illegals come in and they might, you're in trouble and you don't have a place to stay tonight. We're going to put you in a hotel. So no, there should be elimination of all subsidies for coming into this country. There should never be a promise of citizenship just by getting here illegally. That would have to be readjusted drastically because there are probably circumstances that you could make exceptions for. But I'll tell you what, you shouldn't reward illegality. And I think voter ID, if you don't have that, you're just playing games with it all. So then the state should be responsible for it. I know there's talk of moving in this direction. And I always look at the list. They say, this is what you have to use your ID for, your driver's license. And they list about 10 things that you better do and show your ID, but not to vote. Just walk in, and if you get tired voting, just go to the next booth and vote again. I mean, it's pretty nutty anyway. Now so the voting system is horrible under circumstances.
And you're an independent. You're a libertarian. You aligned with the Republicans. You ran as a Republican at times. I thought you'd find this interesting. You know the history of KDKA here in Pittsburgh. I thought you'd find this interesting. They are the cradle of the GOP here. The first Republican convention was held in Pittsburgh in 1856. There hasn't been a Republican mayor since 1934. Pretty interesting stat, huh?
Right, it is. Pittsburgh was an interesting city, and it was always different. We saw the cities as being hardcore Democrats. They were progressives and big spenders. But I always thought there was a conservative streak in Pittsburgh, even with the Democrats, because I happen to be right to life. And at least your senators and all were willing to stand up to the national parties and take that stand. So I always thought that was a good thing to happen. But they face all the other difficulties to what economic system they endorse, the Keynesianism, deficits don't matter. And the other thing that is so universal, that is so dangerous and so financially consuming, and that is the international programs that we have, the interventionist foreign policy, the policing of the world. And that is what usually always brings down great nations, is expanding themselves too far. Right now, I had so many Republican conservatives who liked me in my campaign. They'd always end, I love this, you're spending and all this kind of stuff and freedom. But Ron, I have to tell you, I just don't like your foreign policy. And it was like, you're against the military, you're unpatriotic. And I said, well, how can I be against the military?
I
was in for years. And the military sent me more money than the rest of them all put together. And I thought, well, why should we be surprised? When I was in there, I never met anybody that had a discussion, young, old, or middle-aged, and say, you know what? It's been pretty boring. We haven't had a war for a while. Maybe we'll go over to such and such country, talk to some 18-year-olds to 25-year-olds and say, why don't we get together and have a war? No, it's always the special interests, the weapons manufacturers and the bankers and all of this. And of course, you couldn't finance these wars if you didn't have fiat money.
And we have several things in common, Dr. Paul. We both delivered the Pittsburgh Press at one point in our lives.
Right.
And we both know Green Tree very well. That's where our studios are for KDKA.
Huh.
And we both know Dormont very well. I actually lived there for a while.
My wife lived in Dormont. I lived in Green Tree. I lived on Crestmont Drive, not too far from Potomac Avenue on Green Tree Road. But we went to Green Tree grade school, but then, which I thought was a decent way to go to grade school. I had 8 years there. But then the expansionism came in, and I can remember the discussion. And my dad went to 6 grades of school. He lived and was raised in Green Tree, and he had some questions about that. I remember him in a conversation with a school board member about the size and scope of your district. But then when I left grade school, probably in 48, I went to Dormont High School for 4 years. And my wife, Carol, went to high school there, too. But then later on, it kept getting bigger and bigger. And now, what is it, Keystone Oaks? Is that the high school?
Yep, that's it, Keystone Oaks.
So, I sort of favor smallness. And that's why, I feel pleased because I'd like to believe that I've contributed something to education with my homeschooling program, because it's small. It's small in the sense, no big buildings, not a lot of teachers. But most people who take the course are very, very happy. And there's been a lot more interest in it since all this lockdown has gone on with COVID. Yeah. So there's a lot of people doing homeschooling and private schooling. And I think that is very good, as an option to increase the remnant of people who still might remember about and understand what true liberty is all about.
Yeah, and you have a link to that on your website, Ron Paul Liberty Report. My great-grandmother would sublet some property on a farm in Green Tree and grow vegetables in the summer and to feed the family. And my grandfather once told me he would go to a dairy and drink the fresh buttermilk. Was that likely your family's dairy?
I don't know how it could be anybody else. It was homemade buttermilk in a way. We lived in a really small house and 4 rooms. There were 5 kids. And we had a basement which was pretty small, and yet we had a pasteurizer in there, a homogenizer, a separator, a boiler, and a refrigeration system. And we had, several trucks going out every day. Then there were 3 brothers that ran it, my dad being one. Then there was one brother that would go out around the various farms around Pittsburgh. You didn't have to go very far to find some people with cows that were producing milk, and they'd bring that in and they'd produce, do that every single day. It was a struggle during the war. I was old enough to remember the problem that one uncle was drafted. My mother had to sort of do a lot of the dairy work, receive the milk and weigh the milk and pay the farmers. And then my dad, who always ran the dairy building, the production, he then had to go on a truck and deliver milk. And I went with him a lot, but I would go on that route with him. Well, in Carnegie, we had a route down there, and I was helping my dad. And he says, he pulled up to a curve. He says, "You see that fellow sitting on the porch?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "That's Hannes Wagner."
Really?
And I didn't have I was probably 10 or so or less, but I knew about baseball and I was dumbfounded, and I didn't get his signature.
But you gave him some milk.
Yeah, and I went up and put the milk on so low. That was it.
Oh, that is phenomenal. They have Hannes Wagner Fields down there now. The stadium's named after him, and they have the museum down in Carnegie as well.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe it's close to where I delivered that milk.
Yeah. The Carlinton School District's, their football stadium's called Hannes Wagner Field now. So, yeah.
Is that in Carnegie itself?
Yeah.
When I was still in my residency, I was in my residency up until 68, that Forbes Field was still active because at the end of the day, you could go over, it was walking distance from McGee. I was at McGee. if you could get some coverage, you could walk over there and watch the last couple innings
Oh, wow.
at Forbes Field.
How did you pick the doctor's office over the dairy? And did you ever think of keeping your practice here in Pittsburgh? And how did you get to Texas?
I got to Texas originally because of the force of the federal government. I was drafted.
Oh.
I went to Duke Medical, and then I went and took internal medicine for 2 years at Henry Ford in Detroit. And I was always thinking about doing family practice. So I started off with internal medicine, and then that was in 62, and the government sent me a notice that said I'd be drafted. And if you volunteer, you might be able to pick your service. But if you don't volunteer, you're going to be drafted and you'll be a buck private in the Army. But if you volunteer, you can be a captain in there. I say, I immediately volunteered for the service. So I call myself a volunteer, but it was, I usually tell the story like, defending my military experience, I joined here and there, but it was under a bit duress, but I just made the best of it, and it was sort of a break because it was the first job that paid any money that I ever had. And they sent me to San Antonio. And I was there for 3 years, and then I decided to go back into medicine, picked Pittsburgh, because I think it was family sort of thing. And then while I was there in the residency, I was also in the Air National Guard out at Greater Pitt. I don't even know if they have a unit out there anymore, but
yes, they still do.
They do. I would go out there and I don't know where I got the time to do that, but I did keep up with that, and I had to get flying time in order to stay on flying status as a flight surgeon.
Did you ever want to stay here in Pittsburgh, or did Texas just keep calling you back?
We like Texas, and most of the family started moving away from Pittsburgh. My wife liked warmer weather. And her parents were still living at the time. And after we did make the decision to go back into Texas, they came down and lived there. But it was sort of a fluke again. Sometimes things work out and you don't know exactly the reason. But when I was still at Pittsburgh, I was doing surgery, but I was gabbing with the anesthesiologist who had just come in. He just came from another job. So he came in and he was doing the case I was doing. So we were talking, I said, where are you from? He said, I'm from Texas. I just moved here. And I told him, I said, I'm trying to go back to Texas. So he had been in Lake Jackson and he says, well, there's one OB doctor down there and he's leaving and he is looking for somebody and the back practice has already started. So I came down to Texas, and it was just an opportunity. I was ready to go to work, and it was just built in. I had my office full of patients the very first day. Didn't have to do any building. Personnel was there, and I arrived on 4th of July in '68. And by the time I unpacked my bags, the doctor that had been in charge of this practice, he left town. He was gone at the end of the day. So I remember our furniture had not arrived to Texas yet. We were sleeping on the floor, but we did have our telephone on in the house. And I can remember the very first night the phone rang about 3 o'clock in the morning. I tried to get out of bed, but I was on the floor. So but it changed after that. And we have always enjoyed Lake Jackson. So it was sort of, I didn't have a plan. I think having lived in San Antonio, there were times when I thought we might go back to San Antonio, but I think it was this opportunity that fell in my lap. And Carol was a little bit hesitant. I said, if you don't like it and we don't do it, I said, right now, I think I could go wherever we want. And I said, let's go down for a year. If you don't like it, we'll leave. But we liked it and raised all our kids there. That's where Rand was born.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. Rand was born on our way to Texas. He was actually born in Pittsburgh.
Well, Dr. Ron Paul, it's been an absolute honor catching up with you. Thank you so much for sharing some of your memories of Pittsburgh and also some of your common sense ideals as far as governance goes. We truly appreciate your time. Thank you very much for going one-on-one today. I promised only a half hour. We'll get you out on time. Feel free to give the senator my number as well.
Okay, Kevin, very nice to be with you today.
It's my pleasure. Have a great day and continued success.
Thank you.